Sure.
Go for it.
Okay, here we are at Chag HaMatzot 2019 in Phoenix.
Pahonix.
Excuse me?
I was making fun of the name Pahonix. Just a silly thing Phoenicians do.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about, recently a movie came out called Patterns of Evidence, and they were talking about the origins of the Hebrew, the Semitic alphabet. And there's a bunch of different theories. It's called the Moses controversy, and the reason why they called it that is because some people think, or historically it's on record, that Moshe wrote the 5 books of the Torah. The problem is, and this is where I was talking to Robert here, there's a city called Byblos in Lebanon. And the reason why we call it a Bible, in the Spanish call it Biblia, or library is biblioteca, it all comes from that city. So they say at 1050 BC, somewhere around the city of Byblos, the Hebrew Semitic alphabet was invented. That's standard consideration. And the people who lived there then were the Phoenicians. This is why we call it phonics. Because it has to do with sound. So you have a phoneme is the sound of a, basically the sound of a letter, or the sound of a syllable, you could even say. Like a hieroglyphic would have a phoneme.
Okay.
So, for example, if I use the word par, that's basically a phoneme, it's a sound. So, in Hebrew, you don't use that, you use letters which are not the same as what they were using before this time. So before this time, you have hieroglyphics, hieroglyph, and you have cuneiform. So,
And this is all according to, like,
history, just
what they tell us.
linguistic history, what they tell us.
Yeah.
Okay, so the letters, right, so the English, which is based on the Latin, you've got A, B, C, D, and each one of those letters has a sound. But the hieroglyphics, you'd have a picture. So if you had the picture of a fish, you might say, you could say, well, what sound is that? So you could say, I'm just going to make this up, it's not what it is, but I'm just saying if you have the symbol of a fish, the phoneme you might say was what we would call PHSH, or like we would say fish, but they might say that the sounds of fish might be what you'd think of as that. So if you have the word par, for example, in Hebrew, there's this word called pardes. That's the sound of the actual word. The English equivalent might be paradise, but in Hebrew it's actually spelled pei, resh, dalet, and somic, which is the letters equivalent of a P, R, D, and S. Okay, so in Hebrew, of course, we're reading right to left. So the modern Hebrew would be pei, resh, dalet, and somic. So the point about that is that we would say pardes, but if you're going to write it hieroglyphically, you might say that par, I'm just going to make something up. If you say that par looked like this, that's a hieroglyphic, and then the word des maybe look like that, then you could say, okay, put 2 hieroglyphics, and what you're reading is par des, and what you know that it means is something else. So you're putting together syllable sounds. That's not the same as writing letters. Now the significance of this word pardes in Hebrew is that they say, they use it as an acronym. And if you look at these 4 letters, they'll say this letter, which is the letter P, like I said, they're just playing around. They've invented this. They'll say that this is Peshat, and this is Remez, and this is Drosh, and this is Sod. And so they say these are 4 levels of reading any Hebrew word. So you've got the Peshat, which is the narrative. So you look at Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's the narrative value. And you could just leave it right there and say, okay, that's what the Bible says. So you take it at face value informational level. Remez is the allegory, or it's representing some other deeper truth. Drosh, like if you ever heard of the word midrash, okay, if you put the letter mem as a prefix, and then there's drosh, would be dalet, resh, there might be a vav in there, sheen, or maybe there's no vav, maybe it's just dalet, resh, sheen. But the point is, vav, they say there's no vowels, but yods and vavs kind of sort of act like vowels in the sense that you articulate them as an O as a Y. They sound like vowels,
They
even
may
though
not
they're
be
technically
a
not
letter
vowels.
vowel.
Right, but
The
anyway,
exact difference right there between Phoenician and Biblios.
so the word drosh means to search, or to, well, tavresh is search and explore, but drosh is to go on a study, a very specific study where you're now gonna, like if you do a Bible study, you know, you find a verse, you find a word, let's search this out, let's dig into it. Okay, so if you put a mem in front of it, that turns a non-actual noun, like the word knowledge. To know something, that's kind of a verb type of a thing. Knowledge, it's not a substantive noun, it's not an object. So you stick the mem in front of it, that makes it the object. So droshing is searching, a midrash is the search.
Okay.
So whenever you stick the mem in front of a word, there's a good chance it's a prefix letter. Now some letters, like mayim, mem yod mem, that's just the word water. So not every time you have a letter in front is it a prefix, but a lot of times, if you consider that the letter is a prefix, then look up the other rest of the word, you'll find great insights, and that's the benefit of using the dictionary, which we can elaborate on that later. But what I'm saying is, you have the surface letter level, the allegorical, metaphorical, you know, this story means that. In a lot of sermons, if you have children in, say, a Bible school, they first just got to tell them the story. I mean, that's where a great value is. But then they get into the, let me tell you what this means. Okay, there's the story of the prodigal son, there's the story of the sower of the seeds, the New Testament parables, but they mean something. So now, Remez is getting into what they mean so you can teach a lesson.
The moral of the story.
The moral of the story. Drosh would be, now let's get into what these words really mean. And now this is getting really into intellectual analysis, you might say. But sod, the word sod means family secrets.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're one of them infidels that are trying to find the treasures of the family group, this isn't for you. So, it's kind of like the concept of fool's gold. Now, in California, gold country, if you're going to go try to raid somebody's claim at a mine, I'm just making up this story, but you might want to get some fool's gold and stick it somewhere, and they go, oh, we found it, you know, they'll grab that and they'll run. Fool's gold isn't gold at all, it just looks like gold. So, there's a question about the vowel points, which is called the nikud, which are dots and lines, which are the vowels. So in Hebrew, all the letters are simply consonants, there's no vowels. Yods and vavs act like vowels phonetically, but the point is, why would you do that? Why would you put vowel points? Now, I'm just trying to think rationally and say, well, if you want to leave some fool's gold for the robbers to find and run off with, you don't want them to find the family secrets because that's where your strength, your treasure, your value is. So I'm thinking, just for the record, if you put, here, if you were going to pronounce this da, ra, osh, da, you'd maybe put a line, or maybe 2 lines, both those sound like A. Re, if it was an E sound, you'd have 2 dots here. O, you'd put a dot up here, and then well, there'd be no dot, but if you wanted to say sha, maybe you'd put a line underneath it. So I'd pronounce this da, re, o, sha. Those are the vowels. If I put the dot here, that would be a U sound. If I don't put one, I think this one dot, or maybe no dot, sounds like a V. So I'm just saying that the dots will guide you on how to pronounce the words. So if I say, okay, if you tell me how this is pronounced, you get an A, otherwise you fail the class. Does anybody want to venture and tell me how to pronounce that word?
Red, read.
Yep. Only one answer, not two. Which one is it? Trick question. I'll say you're wrong no matter what. So you can.
Yeah, right.
So the thing is, there's two different meanings,
Yeah.
right? And so the dots of the vowels, the nikud, just so you know the word where we get, if you bump into something and I nicked it, put a mark, that's why they call them nikud, because they're nicked, right? They're little marks put on it. So they'll guide you in saying, this is the way. So it's kind of like not a fake trail, it's a real trail, but if you want to lead the infidel away from the truth, it's a detour. You don't want the infidel to know where, so if you say, listen, well, World War II, from when the Germans were invading Russia, the first thing the Russians did as they were getting out is they took all the road signs away. Why help the enemy find our, figure it out, that before they had GPS. Anyway, what I'm saying is, it's not a bad thing necessarily that somebody put up detours and false road signs. Not that they're false, they're real.
It's not that you're not going to get a positive message out of what you're looking at, but there's more to it.
You might get this level, but you're not necessarily going to get that level.
Yeah.
So, in the Red Dictionary, it has all the vowel points. But looking at the Paleo had no vowel points. So, the study that I conduct, I ignore the vowel points, and I try to look at every possible option. Everything within the possible spectrum of interpretation, because I'm trying to pull together all the information and then assess it or analyze it, or it's doing sleuthing, detective work, of what would otherwise just be evidence or information that you're trying to decide whether it's pertinent or not. And that's where, as we were talking about yesterday, finding a pattern and using the pattern as a skeletal guide, right? So say you're an archaeologist and you're out in Montana or Wyoming and you find some bones and you go, how does this fit together? When I was a kid, Brontosaurus was your basic dinosaur. And then it turned out that there was never such a thing called a Brontosaurus. Somebody put the wrong head on the wrong body, and it, if anything, it was a Diplodocus, and there was a couple other ones, but no Brontosaurus. And it's like, gosh, how do you know what to believe? Figures don't lie, but liars can figure. So you can't even believe necessarily the numbers. That's what we're up against. So the whole reason for doing this type of study at all is because they told us that in the city of Byblos, the Phoenicians invented the Semitic alphabet around 1050 BC, but the problem is, Moshe lived about, what color?
It's not red?
No,
Green.
black. Moshe lived about 1500 BC, which was 500 years earlier. So how is it possible that Moshe could have written the Torah in Hebrew if the Hebrew wasn't invented until 450, somewhere, plus or minus 50 years, who cares back then? But how is that possible? That's the Moses controversy. That's why they made the film. Because they're saying, if the Phoenicians, which is why we call it Bible, Biblia, and phonics, those are the guys that invented it, 1050 BC. Well, just to give you a little bit of a historical perspective. So you have, at 0, we have, okay, here's the timeline. You have Yeshua, right? So this is AD, or what we call CE, Common Era, and this is BC, before Christ, or BCE, before the Common Era. They've changed everything nowadays, so whatever. Anyway, so here we are. If we look at 500-year increments, so if that's 500, that's 1,000, 1,500, and here we are about 2,000. Then back here at 500 BC, we have the era of Daniel and Ezra. And then at 1,000, we basically have David and Solomon. And at 1,500, we have Moshe. And then at 2,000, remember, you know who's at 2,000?
Abraham?
Abraham. Okay, and then if you go back a little further, where was the Tower of Babel? Does anybody know?
I thought Abraham was alive during the Tower of Babel. No?
I think he was after it.
Nimrod. I thought that he was alive. Oh.
What,
Based on
Huh?
what we've read.
this, just for the record, this book here I'll hold it up for the sake of being on the camera. Isaac Moseson, Origin of Speeches, wonderful book, worth having, worth getting. That's the Tower of Babel picture right here. And it might, somebody would have to look, it might tell us in the very beginning what year that was. It doesn't jump out at me, I won't waste time with it. But just to say, it was somewhere, let's just, for round numbers, let's just call it 2,500. It wasn't that, it was maybe even it was 2,300 or something. But Abraham was 100 years old when he had Isaac. So Abraham, I believe, was after Babel by a little while. But Shem, okay, then you have, does anybody know when the flood was?
Well, the angels were put in 3,000 BC. They were punished for all of what they did. So was that around when the flood was too?
I should know this, but the flood was somewhere around between 3,000 and 2,500. It might have been that the flood was 20. I think the flood was 2,500. So, okay, so here's another interesting thing, just for the sake of giving you a perspective. After the flood, okay, before the flood, everybody spoke one language. It said that. At the Tower of Babel, Yahweh scrambled the languages. Now, it's said, and when I say it's said, I don't know who's responsible for that, whether it's the Jews that have kept a track of history or whether it's other linguistic archaeologists, I'm not sure. But they say that at the Tower of Babel, things were separated into 70 languages. And at that point, if you look at the narrative in the book of Genesis, it said that Yahweh scattered everybody according to their language. So the reason why people split up is because of the language. So language has an effect, but one of the facts it has is keeping everybody apart. So in Zephaniah 3:9, he actually quotes it in the first page. You want to read it? Isaac Moseson quotes this first. Now this is a tremendous consideration in light of, tell you what, you want to look at Zephaniah 3:8? She'll read Zephaniah 3:9, and you can read Zephaniah 3:8. The reason I'm mentioning this is because here we are right now, just after 2000. So I'm going to make a little indicator here, 2010, and here we are at 2019. And the question is, how much do we have in front of us to go? So a friend asked once, where do you think we are on the prophetic map? In other words, before the flood, there was a period of time, Garden of Eden and the giants and the dinosaurs, and then all of a sudden, boom, the flood happened, and this is a simple little track of history. A certain event happened right in between here, almost midpoint, at 721 BC.
That's around Micah, Nahum, those guys,
Do you
the
know
minor
what-
prophets.
Do you know what historical event happened at 721? Besides those prophets being active and
Like what they,
Yes.
well, I guess they're
Yeah,
prophets.
what was the critical thing that happened right there?
The 10 northern tribes.
10 northern tribes got wiped out and taken into captivity by Assyria. So here we have the 10 tribes lost because of Assyria taking over. So the interesting thing about that is you could say, gosh, where did the Assyrians come from? Well, if you read in the scripture about David, he had totally subjugated the Assyrians. They were just pinned down. And so that was a foreign culture. They were up in what's now northern Iraq, around Turkey sort of area. And they didn't like to be subjugated. And when Solomon took over, he had been given such a gift that there was no enemies. He was given a gift of wisdom and a gift of wealth. And he would send ships out that it said took 3 years to come back. Well, an interesting correlation is that Magellan took 3 years to circumnavigate the globe. Assuming for a moment the model of the Earth being a globe and not flat, but that's a different story.
You can
Took him
still
3 years
circumnavigate
nevertheless.
it.
Huh?
It can still be circumnavigated. Both
Yes,
ways.
around the flat instead of around. I'm just saying, Magellan was out 3 years to go back to the point of origin. So Solomon's ships were. And they mention getting gold from a place called Ophir, O-P-H-I-R, which happens to be a place in Peru. And the word Peru,
Have you heard of the idea that it's in the Philippines?
no, Ophir,
Yeah.
the thing is, it's kind of like a big mystery hunt, you know, nobody knows. But the interesting thing about the word Peru, does anybody know why that word should be famous?
Should be famous?
The Peruvians, yes, it's famous to the Peruvians. It's the first word ever spoken on planet Earth is Peru.
How do we know that?
How do we know that? Because if you read the Genesis story, once Yahweh invented Adam, he spoke to him and said, Peru uravu, be fruitful and multiply. That was the first word. Peru means to be fruitful. We can look it up in the scripture if you want to. Anyway, this is the word par, which is peresh, and that's this word peresh with a vav. Paru. Just interesting. Having to do with paradise. But anyway, the point is, Solomon's ships went to Ophir, and if it was Peru, that's why the conquistadors came to Peru and raided the place, because they had gold like crazy, you know, and the galleons took it back to give to Rome, and that's why the Vatican is so gilded, even today. Anyway, the point is, okay, you have Zephaniah 3:9, right? What's it say?
I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they may call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent.
Okay, I will restore the people. Which people? He doesn't say. So let's assume that it's all people.
It says peoples.
The peoples with one language. Okay, so Yahuwah himself is going to readdress this period of time from before the Tower of Babel. Now, he's not going to necessarily give us a common language and say, see, I did it, okay, the end of the world now, we're done. It's like, wait a minute. It has a purpose so that they can serve. Now, if that's the word obed, Ayin Bet Dalet, it's also where we get the word obedience, which also means to work. And it also means to worship. So when he says, so that they can serve or worship or be about their business of working, the word, one consent is the word Shechem, which is shoulder. It's like when you want to pick up a big beam and you get a bunch of guys and you put them on your shoulder and it's like you work together. The languages were scrambled so that people could not work together. He's going to restore the language so that people can work together in lieu or in light of his truth. My whole life I've heard the story. Every prophecy that needed to be fulfilled before the return of Jesus Christ has been fulfilled. Any moment could be the last day. He could come right now. No, didn't happen. Well, maybe right now. Didn't happen. Well, 5 minutes from now he might show up. My whole life has been under that regard. And I've heard every prophecy before the end of the world, so the end of the world could be imminent. I have lived 50 years with this hanging over. I'm not more than 50, but I'm saying, I dropped that a few years ago. But I've heard that for 50 years. Well, here's the point. If Yahuwah himself, who scrambled the languages, is it someday in the future going to, let's just take where we are now, is going to restore the language, it's for the sake of continuing on. It's not for the sake of saying it's the end of the world.
Yeah.
That verse says so. Now, what's the first word of that verse?
I will.
No.
In this verse? That's what it says in
Yeah.
the English translation.
Okay, what is it? He left something out. Sorry.
I have a bunch of other
You
translations.
can't trust anybody these days.
I've got a Septuagint, I've got a literal translation, we've got a
I
bunch
can look it
here.
up in this.
Well, he's got it. We'll go ahead and read
Oh,
verse
good.
9.
Okay.
The whole thing?
We'll read verse 9 to start with.
For then.
Oh, okay, stop right there.
there.
For then, well, he's regarding something else. What's he regarding? He's talking about the verse that came right before. So this is the thing.
Oh, okay.
Moses left off the fact that this is coupled to another verse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when he says, okay, for then, it's also translated at that time. Okay, for then at that time, I will restore the pure language. At what time? Now, most times I've ever heard this verse translated or quoted, that's all they read. It's very significant. The interesting thing about verse 8 is that out of all the verses in the entire Bible, verse 8 has within it all 27 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which means the normal 22, but also the 5 Sophite letters. And I believe it's the only verse that does. Now, somebody had said years ago that there was a second verse, I can't remember which one it is, but at least it's Zephaniah 3:8, and it's totally unique, which brings our attention. It's like, if you don't read Hebrew, if you change it into Septuagint Greek or English or
Right,
whatever,
yeah.
it's like, it doesn't mean anything. But why in the world would verse 9 say, at that time, I'm going to restore a pure language, and I'm proposing that the pure language by default, meaning that there can be no options, that the pure language is Hebrew. It's not the English common commercial language. It's not the Greek common commercial language. It's no other language. It's not Aramaic. It's Hebrew, Ivrit, the Edenic language, as Isaac Moses says, which is what this talk is about. We'll get into that in a moment. But the question is, why is it coincidence that that verse, Zephaniah 3:8, has every letter of the Hebrew alphabet, including the 5 Sophites, which didn't show up in the Paleo, so it had to be written towards the more modern. At that time? Why is that? Is he bringing our attention to the Hebrew? In which case, when the occasion happens that he's restoring the pure tongue, hey, that's like right now, because we're talking about the restoration of the pure tongue by even having this occasion, then that means, coincidentally, at the same time, we should be able to anticipate, hope for, that's kufav, be under tension, tikva, is like, that's the hope. The national anthem of Israel is the hope, hatikva. It's to be like a line under strain, like tuning a guitar string. That, like that famous Poor Keter video that was made. Anyway, the point is, read 3:8. This is what's going to happen coincidentally, simultaneously at the same time.
Therefore wait for me, the word of Hashem.
That's the word wait, that's tikva. Yahweh's saying, now remember, he's speaking to people. He's speaking to people way back here in this era, and he's saying, just wait, just wait, just. It's been at least 2,500 years, but just wait for. Sorry, I'm walking late.
For the day when I will arise to plunder them. For my judgment will be For my judgment will be to assemble nations, to gather kingdoms, to pour my fury upon them, all my burning wrath. For with the fire of my jealousy, the entire earth will be consumed. That's what it says.
But that's not the end of the world. Because the next verse says, at that time, I will restore pure language. So something is going to happen at the same time of him restoring the language, that he is going to take all the adversaries of his people that have been mustered against him since this occasion and have been prolonged in their power, their position, and they're ruining the earth. He's going to let them be sustained at least until here, and then he's going to pull them together and wipe them out. But that's never taught. That's never taught. And he's not going to wipe out his people. He's going to uplift and strengthen and preserve his people. Question is, who's his people? That's a different matter. I'm trying to talk about the text here. And I'm saying that because somebody wrote a comment on one of the videos and said, so, the Jews aren't going to be tribulated. Is that what you're saying? That's an interesting. I didn't say that.
Right.
I'm saying his people, known as Israel, and that doesn't necessarily mean those people sitting over there in that land right now with that name, label. The point is, something, okay, so 721 BC, what happened is Solomon inherited the kingdom. Solomon had 1,000 wives and concubines. He let them bring in their idols, their temples, and he even built and he even participated in the worship. So Yahweh said, okay, that's it. I told you if you sustain my regard, I will sustain your family position, and if not, I'm taking it away. That's what happened. And so after Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took over. His son Rehoboam was a punk jerk, amped up the taxes, and so Yahweh ripped the kingdom apart, gave it to a guy named Jeroboam, who went up and became the leader of the 10 northern tribes, and from that point on there was a divided kingdom. The north was the 10 tribes, the south was the 2 tribes. Levi didn't have any inheritance, so that makes a total of 13 because Joseph's 2 sons of Ephraim and Manasseh were counted as 2 tribes. And I'm saying this because a bunch of people have never heard this stuff, just for the sake of the video. Anyway, that happened in approximately 721. Some people say 722. Where do you start the calendar? Whose regard? But in Leviticus 26, he says 4 times, 4 happens to be a dalet, a door, but he says, if you don't like what I say, if you consider my words to be abhorrent, loathsome, reprehensible, disgusting, then the curse is going to come upon you 7 times, or 7 ways. The word is Shavah, 7. The number 7 is spelled Shin, Bet, Ayin, but it also means to swear a vow, or to be under a curse, or to be what the word is surfeited, which is to be full or satisfied. It's where we get the word for the surf of the ocean, the foam that's billowing over. So, you pour a good ale into a cup and, the foam, and that's surfeited. So he said the number 7 means committed to a vow, the curse you get for breaking the vow, and the vow will be fulfilled. And then we get this picture of Yahweh's way of doing things, which is good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and overflowing. So that number 7, the word Shabbat, is a picture of do what he said, live up to the vow, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, overflowing, and then your blessings will be poured upon you the same way. And if you break the vow, the curse is going to come, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and overflowing. And he said it would be for 7, and he says that 4 times. What is that even supposed to mean? Well, in Ezekiel chapter 4, Ezekiel was told neither the north or the south had been overwhelmed yet, but he was told to lay on one side naked for 40 days, pointing at he had to make this little piece of artwork like the siege of Jerusalem. He just had to sit there and lay at it, and he had to cook his food on dung, and it's like, what? It's just like, wouldn't fit in our culture. He'd be arrested. But the point is, it's like, what? That's just nuts. Lay there and point 40 days, laying on one side, and then lay on the other side for 390 days. That's over a year. Lay there for a year, pointing at this thing, talking to whoever comes by. Well, the 40 days was for the southern kingdom. It was a metaphorical, a remez of the coming, you might say, the annihilation of Yahweh's people. And then the 390 years was for the northern kingdom. So when the event happened that the northern kingdom was taken out first in 721 BC, Assyria, who had been kept down by David, suddenly blew out of their container, and they became known as some of the worst torturing terrorists that the world has ever known. Just gladly doing the most horrific things to their enemies. And they ripped apart the Northern Kingdom. But a bunch of people in the Northern Kingdom, according to Stephen Collins' research, at that time went to what became known as Carthage, which was actually, I think it's pronounced like Kirith Chadash, became known as Carthage. But anyway, it meant new city. It's Hebrew. And they also went to Iberia, which came from the word Hebrew, which is Spain. And a bunch of them went to the New World, the Western Hemisphere that nobody knew about, but they took off. So at that event, a bunch of them jumped ship and took off west. A bunch of the other ones were taken into captivity into the area of what's now northern Iraq. Well, 130 years later or so is when the southern kingdom was taken into captivity by Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel was taken into captivity, and he said 40 years, but because they didn't keep 490 years of the land Sabbath, it was cranked up to 70, which is 1 out of 7. And so Daniel was the wisest of the wise men, and he was in the archives one day, and he goes, wait a minute, he's reading this, he says, we were supposed to be in here for 70 years according to something Jeremiah said, 70 years. We've done our time, we've done our 70 years. So he prayed. You said we were going to get punished for 70 years. We've done our 70 years. Can we please come home? And Yahweh said, yes, certainly, that was the deal. That was your prison sentence. You've done your 70 years. So Yahweh put the burden on Cyrus, the Persian king who took over from the Babylonians, and funded with both military and provisions and economics, the finances. He funded the entire return of the captives, whoever wanted to go back to Jerusalem. That was 70 years later for the southern kingdom. What about the northern kingdom? They never came back. But he had said 70 was for the southern, 70 a day for a year, so that was 70 years, the captivity. Actually, he said 40, and then it was also, that was from Ezekiel, and that was from Jeremiah. Here he just said 390. Well, if you, just for what it's worth, if you're at 390 and you start in 721, you can do the math. 400 years later would be, 331, right? That's 390 years later? Okay, so 331, do you know what was going on around 331? Alexander the Great. So, the only thing I can figure is sometime around the history of Alexander the Great, the northern kingdom had a shot at coming back. They said, no way. We like it out here. Yahweh said part of the curse in Deuteronomy 28 as well as Leviticus 26 is that you will forget who you were, you will forget I was ever your Elohim, and you will get a different language, a different culture, and totally obscured. So, 390 years later brings you to about 60 AD. What happened around 60 AD?
Temple destruction.
Yeshua had just been here saying, I'm only come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and then Rome came in. This is Alex. Rome came in and wiped out the temple and just kicked everybody out of the land again, because for some reason the 10 northern tribes must have. Now, even though Paul went up to Turkey, which is where a bunch of them gotten scattered, and even though Yeshua said, I've come specifically for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, he didn't get the response he was looking for. Well, 390 years later brings you to what, 450? What was happening around 450 AD?
Can I interrupt for a minute?
Yeah,
You're counting in 390 years.
increments.
How come?
Because he said 4 times, this is Leviticus 26, 4 times he said he would multiply it by 7. So I'm saying, let's think, what does that mean? If he says, I'm guessing now, I'm trying to figure out at the Drosh Sod level, what was he telling us? If he's saying, you were taken into captivity in 721, and I'm telling you, if you come back, but your prison sentence is 390 days, according to Ezekiel, a day for a year, then the same way that Daniel said, we've put in our 70 years, can we come home? And Yahweh said, yes. At 390 years, he has to give the same deal to the northern kingdom. So, did anybody in the northern kingdom say, hey, can we come home? We've put in our prison sentence. Did anybody around the era of Alexander the Great say to Yahweh, hey, we've put in our 390 years, can we come back to the land? Can we come back to the terms of the covenant? History doesn't record it. Didn't happen. That's why they're still even today called the lost 10 tribes. We jump ahead to the days of Yeshua, another 390, because I'm figuring if he said 4 times, why did he do that? Let's suppose it means something. Let's suppose it's a pattern. 4 happens to be a door, right? You got A, B, C, D. So you got the Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, and the word Dalet literally means door. So I'm guessing, just looking at stuff, that maybe he offered 4 doors. 4 doors to come home from the prison banishment. That's called the diaspora, or the dispersion, 4 times. So I'm just trying to do the mapping and say, okay, if this was at the time of Rome, what the next 390, so you have 1 increment, 2 increment, 3 increment, what happened around 450 AD? In 321, just for what it's worth, or 321 or 325, you have the Council of Nicaea.
Interesting.
Well, this is the beginning of the Catholic Church. So 100 years into the Catholic Church, then you've got Rome being split, right, into Eastern and Western Rome. So here you have Rome, you got Eastern and Western. So that's like major European history going on. Okay, but again, nobody came back. So another 390 years brings us to 840, right? Isn't that when the Huns were running around? The Huns and Vikings, I think. The Vikings might have been a little bit after that. Anyway, it's another scourge that just came from Europe and just was like wiping out, just wrecking everything. And if you look at what was going on in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, it's the description of the curse.
So that would be the 4th door right there.
That would be the 4th door. And then if he says, okay, and if you still don't come back, now he doesn't say this, but if you still don't come back, he says, it'll be times 7. Okay, so in other words, this is the way I'm reading this, and I didn't invent this. Somebody else brought this to my attention back in 2004. I had never heard of this, and I've mentioned this to a number of people. I've mentioned it in a number of videos, but a lot of people never heard these things. Have you ever heard of any of this? You've heard something?
No, one reason my hand, it makes sense, because if you go another 390, I don't know if you can do it, in the 1230s is the Mongols. And you add another 390 to that, you're at the Spanish Inquisition.
Which is 1660.
I don't, well, actually I think it's 100 years.
Well, it would have been 12, 13, 14, 15.
Yeah, it would be 50.
Yeah, 16. Yeah. So the point is, you know, if every 390 years we're looking at just the horrors of hell. Now imagine this scenario. Before the history of the world, before back here, before the world began. So this wonderful, loving creator deity is sitting up there thinking, hey, I got a great plan. I'm going to invent a place called Earth, and I'm going to stick humans on it. Oh, this should be lots of fun. Is this what he had in mind? Are you kidding me? He's going to sit there and torture these people like crazy, and that's his idea of a fun project? And then I just had somebody the other day saying, I can't believe in God because look at the terrible things everybody does to each other. Is that why you can't believe in him? That's a good reason, because why should a loving God, especially I've had this question asked my whole life. I've talked
Why
to
do we
people.
blame God for something we're doing to each other?
Because he's the guy that allows it or is in control, or here,
We have.
this is the kicker, man. You read Leviticus 26 and a few other places in the scripture, and he says he's going to orchestrate it.
Well, certainly, he's had to orchestrate what will happen if we choose to not follow the directions.
See, that's the point. See, I'm using words of a description which are only a piece of the story. What you just added is the other side of the story.
For the sake of the video, I'm correct, the Spanish Inquisition was in 1480, so it doesn't line up.
Just for what it's worth, there's a certain fellow by the name of Dale Sanchez. If you want to look up his work, Dale Sanchez. And he did research on the Spanish Inquisition and maintains that it's actually still going on. They messed with approximately 80 million people. It went on for hundreds of years, including in the Western Hemisphere, in Texas and in Mexico and in Colombia. There are still dungeons of Spanish Inquisition torture machinery, which are too hideous to even walk in the door of, from people I know who've been there.
That makes me think of those churches. There's like 8 different Spanish churches that are completely decorated and built out of human bones.
So the question is, why? Why? Okay, why? Go back and look at Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26, and its other places. But those are the two just right there. Here's the point. He said in Ezekiel 4 that 390, and if we multiply by 7, then that total is 2,730 years. And just like he told Daniel, 40, and then you can come home. If Daniel and if the rest of the Jews had said, no way, we like being Babylonians, it probably would have gotten 7 times that. It went to 70 instead of the 40 because of the Shemitah year curse that Jeremiah talked about. That was a different matter. But here's the point. By legal mandate of justice, 7 times 390 is 2,730. And if you start with 721, guess what? You end up with 2010. Period. There's no year 0, so that 721 instead of being 2009 is 2010. There's no year 0. So that curse had to be legally completed as of 2010. That means that my parents, my grandparents, and everybody between here and here is in the envelope of a curse mandated by Yahweh, warned about in Leviticus 26, enforced as of Ezekiel chapter 4, initiated in 721, but as of 2010, it's over. The prison door is over. It's open. And so what are we doing now? Returning to these words. Going back to this occasion. Why? Zephaniah 3:8. The next thing on his to-do list is to take all these people groups that he had set up, and he told his people, I can show you, my friend is documented 100 chapters that he's found that's talking about this. He's going to take the very people groups that he called in to smash, ruin, destroy, grind his people. And he says, though I said, I'm going to pour out my fear on my people. But though I was only a little disturbed at my people, a little disturbed? Are you kidding? Look at the Spanish Inquisition, the Mongols, the Huns, the Romans, a little disturbed. But then he says, I'm going to assemble these nations, and I'm going to pour out my fury on them who have ravaged my people for the last 2,730 years. And then I'm going to lavish my grace, my love, my care on my people who are called, who have called on my name, who are called by my name. That's what's in front of us. And I've never heard this taught. And I've heard other people tell me that they have never heard this taught. It's never discussed. Why? Because it was hidden. Because he said, this is part of the curse. You will forget you were ever my people. You will forget I was ever your Elohim. You will forget my words. You will forget my ways. And he hid it in the foreign languages. So did he allow Greek and English? Absolutely. He probably drove that bus himself. But that's why this restoration back to the Paleo-Hebrew is so incredible, astounding, awesomely, mind-blowing. What an opportunity. Okay. Furthermore, if you go back to say, but how do we know that Hebrew is the original great language? Because the hieroglyphs were actually drawings of pagan deities, heathen idols. You can't write the words of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh using drawings of pagan idols. He said, don't let their names come out of your mouth. And the word name is Shem, which also means story, narrative. It also means fame, renown, and reputation. Do not talk about the stories. When I was in LA Baptist High School, we learned the Greek and Roman deities. We never learned about Yahweh and the Moedim. What the heck? Why would LA Baptist High School teach the students Greek and Roman, heathen, pagan, idolatrous nothings and leave out the Moedim, which are the testimonies, the witnesses of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh? Because we were still under the curse. That can be my only answer. The word moed, mem, vav, ayin, dalet, is translated festival. Moed, if you add im, that makes them plural. The root center is ayin, dalet, which is the word for witness and testimony. And if you look at ayin, dalet, yod, edi, it means choice, best, treasure. It means jewelry, ornamentation. It means I have bejeweled myself with things that testify of my grandeur, my name, my intention, my teachings. That's Yahweh speaking first person, because the letters of the alphabet are self-referential of their author, starting with Aleph, meaning I am or I will. They're all about Him. His choice best ornamentation are these Moedim festivals. And the Christian church, even still today, has zero regard. I was just down in California talking to a pastor, talking to another guy who's over 80 years old, and mentioned the word Easter. It comes from Ishtar, which is Ashtart, which Yahweh repeatedly says is an offense. Do not allow the Ashtoreth poles, otherwise known as maypoles, to arise in my land. Do not. Let's call it Easter. It's not Easter. He was killed on Pesach. Not Easter. At least the Greek Orthodox say Pascha or Pesach. The point is, we have intentionally blended, amalgamated heathen rituals and called it Christianity. Well, gee, that's what happened right here. Thank you, Constantine. Because it was part of the curse. I'm not kicking around the Christians or the Americans, or it was Yahweh's way. And it's all to say, we can't look at any of this and say, boy, let's study history. What? Let's study what's about to be in front of us. And it's not the end of the world. It's the end of the curse. It's the end of the coma that we have been self-induced, like Yahweh's sleeping beauty. He always calls Israel his beloved. Ani ladodi vidodi li. And we bit the poisoned apple and have been in a coma until at least 2010. But now, the kiss of our Prince Charming Yeshua, wake up. Let me show you the truth. That's in the Paleo-Hebrew. Because every letter speaks of His name, His identity. Therefore, when Patterns of Evidence says, oh, there's evidence that Canaanites invented the Semitic alphabet, borrowing hieroglyphic characters, only turning them into fish hook and camel and house. No, it can't be. That's another obfuscation. It's a blurring. Yes, there's a correlation, but I know that the Hebrew can't be developed by Canaanites because the Canaanites had no regard of Yahweh. And Aleph and Bet and Gimel, the study of the Hebrew alphabet, is all the Shem of Yahweh. It's all Yahweh telling who He is and what He's going to do, and every letter points to Yeshua being the Mashiach. Not the Jesus Christ guy who did away with it and had his church conduct the Inquisition, but every letter. Here, we'll just run it real quick. So if you start with Aleph, Aleph, when it's a prefix letter of a verb. Now there's some word like adar that starts with an aleph. Adar means to be honorable and glorified and majestic and beautiful and grand, but it's not a prefix letter. But when aleph is a prefix letter, like I will bless you, so Bres is Baruch, so if you say Vareka, that would mean I will bless. Okay, when aleph is a prefix letter, it basically means I am, or it's I will. So the 4 or 5 words, Ehyeh, Anoki, Ati, that start with an aleph, basically, self-person, okay, so now if I say, okay, we've got 22 letters, let's read those 22 letters as one communication, instead of 22 little glyphs that mean nothing. Now, when I say that, a fellow named Miles Jones recently wrote a book called The Writing of God. He had Michael Rood, Jim and Penny Caldwell, and a few other people that were noteworthy for finding archaeological stuff give him statements on the book saying, hey, this is a great, wonderful book. And Miles Jones says a number of times in that book, half a dozen times at least, he says the great significance of Yahweh writing with his finger on tables of stone is that he extracted meaning from the letters. So cuneiform, just as a bunch of sticks, it almost looks like, kind of like Chinese. They're just a bunch of lines. They might be ordered, they're just lines, they're wedge-shaped lines. Okay, so Miles Jones is saying the ancient Hebrew symbols mean nothing. They're just sounds. But he said if the hieroglyphic language that existed before were pictures of pagan deities, and human consciousness was able to reach so high, like bumping into the ceiling, when Yahweh wrote with his finger on tables of stone, taking away the pagan reference, man's consciousness expanded, and then you got into abstract thought, which opened up human consciousness. And 500 years later, because that happened right about here, or 1,000 years later, you bump into the Greeks, and they flipped the alphabet from reading left to right to left. So it made the dominant side of your hemisphere of your brain the other one. So all of a sudden, at that time, the Greeks developed philosophy and mathematics and all this great science. It's like, wow. So just changing the alphabet and looking at the letters meaning nothing broke open human experience and thinking into the beyond what the pictures could. Well, if that's true, imagine the significant impact of seeing every letter being the truth of Yod He Vav He. That's going to just, bam, make human consciousness explode with the possibility, because he said, if he didn't change the language back here, nothing they thought would be withheld from them. That means that the potential of human brain activity and consciousness has been kept back with reins because of the language. And going back to the Paleo-Hebrew and realizing these are not pagan heathen drawings. These are not meaningless lines. These are the very revelation of the greatest truth. Because back in the beginning, when he made the world as an expression of these 22 letters, he designed human consciousness fit to that statement, that revelation, that expression. Human consciousness then fits these Hebrew letters like a hand to a glove. And it was all designed for human consciousness to expand into its fullest potential, which it hasn't yet. That's what's in front of us. So if I am is the Aleph, then that means every other letter has to be speaking about himself, of who he is and what he's going to do. It's intent, and it's his own personal being, its identity. So if Bet is basically an embryo shape, but it's also the physical universe, because this is the word spelled Aleph Bet, actually Aleph Bet Hey is Ava, where we get the word Abba, which is father. But it also in the dictionary says it means to want something passionately or to refuse energetically. So Aleph Bet is the interior state of willing, wanting. But Bet, if you write the word Bet Nun, that's the word Ben, which is son. That's to be put into the construct state. Because the word Bet Nun, hey, it means to build or construct, like building a house. The word bet